So, my friends, I think we're back in business. I hope so. So, thank you for giving the feedback. I'm going to start this all over again, and I guess you didn't hear what I had to say in the first place. But what I was going to say is that this is uh, an interesting topic to me. I think comes out of Tom Gilbert's work, where he talked a lot about exemplary performance, and what he meant was the performance of exceptionally high performers, which sometimes we kind of think of as sort of magic, and but it's not. It's small bits of behavior which people have one way or the other discovered, learned, made up, fallen into, whatever it is, that make an enormous impact on their productivity and the quality of their work. And so we want to talk a little bit about that and about how we've adapted Tom Gilbert's concepts related to that in performance thinking with our simple models and framework. Before we get into that, though, I want to remind you, we put these in YouTube, on the YouTube channel after several days of editing goes on. So these should be on the YouTube channel by the weekend. You can just go to YouTube and search for the Performance Thinking Network, or you can use that URL, performancethinking.tv. We've also been, over the years, on and off, creating some free study guides, although we've paused on that for a while now. But if you want to get in the mailing list for those, you can use that QR code on the right. And the other thing is, if you are watching this recorded on YouTube, I really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel, and that way you'll get notices when new videos go up. And also, if you'd pass it on, share it with your colleagues, because I'm hoping you have colleagues that might be interested. And one more thing before we get into it. Next month, November 20th, I want to talk about something that's been sort of bubbling to the surface for a while, and it's really come out of, to some extent, my conversations with my colleague Ian, who I see is here, and also with some other folks, and just my own reflection. We've been refining and developing this approach we call now performance thinking since the late 1980s, if you can believe it. And the objective was really to make things simple and accessible to people in a variety of ways, using plain models, using plain English, and so forth. And what I've started to recognize was that in being able to summarize accomplishment-based performance improvement, and as we often say, these two simple pictures and 21 plain English words, we've got a thing that kind of you can look at the world through in a simple way, but that essentially integrates everything we know from behavior science and performance engineering. And so I want to talk a little bit about how all the parts hang together and how our understanding of performance becomes, through the lens or the filter of this framework, a holistic, integrated systems view. And it has a lot of power, I think. And you're probably already registered if you clicked on the thing which said register for me for the future. But of course, you or anybody who's watching this can use that QR code on the left there to register. Now, we're talking about these kind of people in a way. I selected some pictures of people that I thought were, without any question, in the public eye, exemplary. I think we would have to say that Taylor Swift is a remarkably exemplary performer, as is LeBron James, and has been for years. Robin Williams was exceptional in so many ways that everybody recognizes. Tom Brady, whether you like him or not, has certainly been called the greatest of all time. And even if he isn't quite the greatest, he was extraordinary in how long he was able to perform and how well he was able to perform consistently across two teams. And of course, Bob Dylan, Bob now in his old days talks about he can't even figure out how he created the songs he did in the beginning. That was kind of like magic to him, which seems to me to be an extraordinary example of unconscious competence in a way. And then Georgia O'Keeffe, who may be a less familiar person, was an amazing artist in so many ways, and probably people who know her art will appreciate that. So this is just almost like a random selection of exemplary performers. And when we see them, we tend to say, oh my God, this is magic. This is, and they are unique people. We're not going to turn people into LeBron or Taylor or any of these folks, but we can capture some things from how they perform that account for some of their exceptionality, and we can help other people get better. And so that's kind of the whole point of this session. Now, the agenda, I want to talk a little bit about how this started with Tom Gilbert and his notion also of the potential for improving performance, which we have renamed the upside potential, and I'll explain why that is shortly. And then how do we find exemplary performers? Like, how do we recognize them? And also, what are they exemplary in, if you will, if that's the right preposition to use? And how do we uncover some of their tricks? And that phrase, sometimes even for them, what I mean by that is that there's a lot of folks that if you ask them, if they're extraordinary performers, salespeople, customer service people, maintenance techs, whatever it is they do, if you ask them what they do, they often can't tell you, because these things are unconscious competence in many respects, to use a commonly used phrase. And so, and then once we do identify some of these bits of behavior that we're pretty sure account for their exceptional performance, what do we do with it? And then I'm hoping we can have some discussion. We often don't at the end of these, and probably because I take a lot of time, probably because I sort of blast stuff at you. But I'd really appreciate it if you have a piece of paper and a pencil or pen next to you. As we go, if there's ideas, insights, or questions you might have, maybe we can talk about those at the end. So this is, this is basically where. Just a second here, I want to make a slight change. But this is really where where I started with Tom Gilbert in his book that I think everybody in this group has read, or at least the names that I see, Human Competence. And he talked about, this is for any of you that know this work have seen me quote this before, but he said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he didn't mean behaviorists or trainers. He meant everybody, managers, leaders, anybody that's trying to improve performance. We tend to focus on activity. But he said we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So those who've taken Tom seriously have shifted their focus, have shifted their paradigm to the valuable products of behavior that he called accomplishments. Now, as a bunch of you know, we sort of coined the phrase work outputs. And the reason we did that was frankly because I didn't want to get into arguments about what the word accomplishments means. People have different ideas about that. And I don't want to argue that we have a better definition. So we've coined the phrase work outputs. And the reason for that is also that there's a micro level that we've addressed that I don't think Tom or Joe Harless, his most important protege, really did. They were inclined to talk about accomplishments or outputs at a big level, so that a job might only be, defined by let's say 4 or 5 major accomplishments. And as most of you whose names I see here recognize, we drill down to a smaller level of this because we think it's more actionable. Now, our first model, as you all know, is the performance chain, and we want to be sure that in any project or effort or coaching session or anything else where we're trying to work on performance, that we start out knowing what's at stake. In other words, we're talking about business results, or if you're in a not-for-profit or someplace that's not really a business, you can talk about organizational level results. But those are the things that are indicators of how successful the whole entity is being. Sometimes it's societal results, but we want to be sure we know what's at stake. But then we take a look at some hunk of performance and we say, okay, what are the outputs here? What are the accomplishments? Is it a role that we're trying to build and support and develop? Is it a process? Is it a team's performance? What are the valuable products? And there's many, many kinds of those products, as you know, probably. Once you know what the outputs are, of course, that guides you to the behavior. And so it's a lot easier to know at that point, what we should focus on from a behavioral point of view, because we know it's the behavior that produces the outputs. And this is where our conversation today is directed. How do we know which bits of behavior make a big difference in people's production, exceptional level of quality and quantity in their outputs? And then finally, we Finally, we look at all the behavior influences that support or get in the way. So that's our first model. Most of you are familiar with it. It works from left to right. We analyze it from right to left. And of course, our focus is on the accomplishments of the outputs, because what we say is that this entire analysis is typically anchored to those outputs that we know are valuable to the extent they contribute to the organization's results. Now, one of the things about that is outputs make it a lot easier to measure. And my dear friend Bob Redeker, who was one of our most experienced performance thinking program facilitators, both of our coaching program and our practitioner program, he said years ago, and I keep quoting him, he said, if we can get clear with our clients about work outputs and criteria for good ones, we can do measurement easily by counting work outputs. Now, of course, we can also measure or count behavior, and we can look at organizational results. But outputs here are the secret to this, because when we talk about productivity, we're talking about levels of quality and quantity in those outputs typically. Now, here's an example. And again, many of you are familiar with this tool that we adapted something like 30 years ago. We call it the individual performance map now. We used to call it a customer diagram, but it has the definition of the name of the performer in the middle. In this case, this is a specific individual, actually, chief learning officer in a bank that was responsible for digital transformation. And what you see around the frame of this is the outputs that he delivered to those different customers, internal or external customers. So there's things like a vision statement, a list of priorities, specific relationships of various kinds, hiring criteria, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that he produced and delivered. And so this is a typical example of defining the level of outputs or accomplishments that I referred to earlier. And we can measure them. These are a couple charts. These are not of that gentleman. These are in the marketing world. This, for example, is the acceleration of the number of subscribers to our study guides for a period of time last year, actually. And then this is a number of group members in our LinkedIn group, and it was accelerating after we did some interventions there. And these are just examples, but the point is we can count work outputs, which makes it kind of nice. Easy, relatively speaking. Now, here's another example of a pretty complicated job. And so this gets into the conversation about, well, how do we know the person is exemplary? What is it that's exemplary here? Because this person has a lot of outputs as a clinical supervisor in a behavioral health organization that delivers a lot of stuff. And you can see treatment plans there in blue, and that was prepared for another presentation I did, but notice that sometimes people produce outputs and deliver them to multiple customers. A question is she or he, but is in this case, is she exemplary in any of her work outputs? All of them? Some of them? How do we figure that out? And my observation is that in certain fields, and Tom Gilbert often used the example of the Yellow Pages salesperson. This was a long time ago in the 60s and 70s where he was coming up with that example. But remember, that's before the internet. It was almost before email. And it was salespeople who worked on the phone to sell Yellow Pages ads. Now, the beauty of that job is you could measure the sales, you could measure the revenue. It was pretty straightforward, and you could figure out who your top people were. That's not always the case with a lot of outputs. So one might ask for a clinical supervisor to use this as an example, like, what does exemplary mean? And how would you apply that to some or all of their outputs? So, for example, if they produce treatment plans, for their clients, an extraordinary and unusual clinical supervisor might be the one that always gets it done on time. It never needs to see a revision. It's just really good. You say, well, how does she do that? Or decisions, which are outputs to change programs once they're implemented, that we can always pretty much trust that if those changes get made by her, the client's going to make progress. Or appointments. One of the challenges in this world, in the world of clinical supervision and behavioral health companies, is if clinical supervisors and their behavioral technicians actually work, whether in a center or out in people's homes, they have appointments. And so sometimes those get missed or misscheduled in different ways. And in this case, let's say an exemplary performer never has those happen. Somehow she figures out how to always make the appointments happen. Or satisfied behavior technicians, the people that report to her. If you have an organization with a bunch of people in this role, and you say to the behavior techs, you say like, who's like who's great, or you get rating scales from them or whatever it is, the person that winds up having the best supportive relationships with their behavior techs is somebody we ought to take a look at, probably. Or relationships with parents. This is a role where there's often ongoing or intermittent relationships with parents of clients who are asked to do things. So, if that's an output, like if all of the parents say this person is amazing, I love working with her, she does such great things with my child, blah blah blah, again, you want to look at that person, because that isn't always what you hear from parents about clinical supervisors. Or if the job of this clinical supervisor includes interviewing with clients or their parents who want their child to be in your program, it is possible that some parents are shopping around and they may not always choose to go with your program. And so what if you've got a clinical supervisor who, whenever she's in the room in those initial conversations, those people show up? There's something going on here. This person has a sideline of being a good salesperson or whatever. And so forth. It goes on and on. But, these are ways to think about it. It isn't always just the frequency. It's often the quality or the likelihood of some output or accomplishment. Now, obviously, we'd like to have hard measures. That's why Tom Gilbert's example of the Yellow Pages salesperson fits so nicely into this conversation, because, you could count the number of sales, the number of ads, the number of dollars. But what I've observed over the last 40 plus years is that there's a lot of outputs and there's a lot of jobs that organizations don't measure very well and maybe are hard to measure. In sales, you can almost always do it. Often in customer service, you can, if you have things like first-time resolutions of calls in from customers, or if you have customer satisfaction surveys, you can often tell, oh, that person's really good because they give her always fives and they're really happy and they never have to come back. She solves their problem. And a lot of productivity kinds of jobs, they're counts of outputs per unit time. But we don't always have those. And but when we do, of course, we can count outputs that meet criteria or that are defined as good. And a lot of times, in the absence of really hard data, we can inquire about timeliness and quality. That is, always on time or before deadlines and always good. There's some people, my son is a software developer, for example, there's some people in that world that, man, they're good. And you say, I want to go find out how he or she does this. And so we don't always have hardcore measures, but there's ways to go about finding these people. And frankly, one of the things that I've used over the years that I think can be very helpful is if you go into an organization and you're, let's say, looking at customer service folks or first line team managers or whatever their job is, and you ask a bunch of their colleagues, you say, if I want to really learn how to do this, who should I go to show me? And in many environments, it's not a random answer. In many environments, they say, Jack, Jack's only been here for a year, man, but he is really good at this thing. And he's got, I don't know how he does it, but he has this very high level of productivity, and the people that work with him love him and blah, blah, blah. You should go talk to him. So that's a little fuzzy. It's quite the opposite, perhaps, of hard data. But I've found that in many cases, that will take me to some extraordinary performers. Now, Gilbert had this framework where he talked about levels of performance, and, there'd be exemplary stars or performers at the top, and there'd be average people and most, successful performers, and then there'd be some poor performers. And one of the sort of side points about the poor performers thing is that there's lots of reasons they don't perform well. And sometimes there are things that are happening at home or medical issues and so forth. So we don't want to sink all of our time into trying to help them, though, of course, we would like to help them if we can. But if you say that there's something like a bell-shaped curve, that, you've got a lot of pretty successful average people, and then you've got a few people that are like quite a lot better. And those could be individuals. They could also be teams, of course. So they could be even assembly lines where you have multiple ones and it's a whole process. But whatever it is, whether they're individuals or teams or the people managing a process, running a process, there's some exemplary folks. And what Gilbert talked about, he used the idea of performance and potential for improving performance. He called it P.I.P. It's a great concept, but I changed that some years ago because when I would use the phrase P.I.P. or the acronym in a lot of organizations, they thought I meant performance improvement plan, which is the thing that HR people do with an employee that's not doing so well, sort of before they exit them. And so that didn't have a good vibe. So we renamed it upside potential, but it's the same idea. It's the gap or the ratio between your top performers and your average performers, your average successful performers. And Tom's notion was that the bigger that gap, the more opportunity you have to improve it. So if the best people are not really doing much better than everybody else, it may not even be worth looking for exemplary behavior. But if there's a big difference, you want to find out what those stars do, because if you can, and you can share those bits that you discover with average people, you can raise the whole team, the whole organization. And that may be worth a lot of money or time or payback. So that's the concept. We're trying to leverage the upside potential for the benefit of the whole organization by discovering what some of the best people do. And, so that's the general idea here. Now, we've sort of mentioned a little bit about this, but want to dig a little bit more into how we identify them, because clearly in some cases it's very obvious. For example, my colleague Barbara Buckland and I have worked with a lot of sales organizations, and we will ask them who their could we talk to a few of your really extraordinary performers and also some of your good average successful performers. And it isn't always true, but sometimes they say, oh yeah, there's these two people who I don't know how they do it, but man, they're good. And so you go talk to them. And so, and sometimes, of course, in a sales environment, they actually have numbers, though not always, but often they have numbers that they can use some hard data. But one of the interesting challenges about this that I've observed with sales and customer service and other kinds of jobs is that some people are good at some parts of their jobs and not so good at others. So anybody who's even heard about sales development has probably heard about people. Oh man, she's a real closer. She can close the deal, man. You put her in a room with the client and you got a deal going. Whereas maybe she wasn't that great at creating proposals. Maybe there's other people who create compelling proposals that always get people to the table, but this particular person is good at getting the deal at the end of the process. So that's just one example, but a lot of times people are good at specific stuff. And that's why the question of, if you wanted to learn how to do this, who would you go to? And I'm talking about this in a specific way. Very often that will direct you to the people who are extraordinary at that thing. In fact, I've worked with organizations where they had internal kind of social network systems where people knew who the best folks were to do certain kinds of things. They were acknowledged experts and superior performers. And so if you needed to know how to do this kind of thing with this kind of a context or situation or client, you should call that person because they're the best. Now, the third bullet here is kind of important because so often it's not they do everything differently. This is something that Gilbert pointed out a lot. And it's often really small differences in behavior that separate those top from average people. Now, one of the ways you can figure that out, and we'll sort of talk about this at several points going forward, but one of the ways is if you interview, let's say, about the contributions or the work outputs of a job, and you talk to a bunch of good, solid, average performers, and then you talk to maybe a couple people or whatever has been identified of really superior performers, you'll often discover, once you identify the work outputs, and maybe the ones where there's a big difference, very often if you'll talk to both of those groups, you'll hear something from the extraordinary performance and you say, oh, no wonder, obviously that works. Okay, let's capture that one. Because sometimes once you see what the behavior is, it's kind of obvious. But often they can't tell you. Gilbert's sort of slightly humorous way of saying that was a world-class or expert tennis player can't tell you what she's doing because she's not watching her feet while she plays. But very often, top performers are unconsciously competent. They do things, and they maybe even have internal behavior, like how they look at a particular kind of spreadsheet or like that they can't even tell you. So you've got to go, ideally, interview them. But the ideal is to actually spend time and observe them, to watch them doing this stuff. Now, I've been an external consultant for pretty much my whole career since I started my first company in 1982. And very seldom have I found that client organizations are willing to spend the money to have me spend days at a time following their people around. So sometimes we get to observe, a lot of times we don't. And that puts a pretty significant limitation on it. But we can still discover this stuff, often through interviews. Now, here's a few examples from my own history that some of you have heard before, because I noticed some names here, people who've been in our programs. But I think they're great examples. One was customer service representative. And it was a Chinese American woman, and she worked for a cell phone company. And she had two indicators of superiority. One is that she had very, very high customer service ratings from her customers. And they say, after this call, would you be willing to fill out a little survey? And people would say yes, and then they do it. And this woman would be she'd all fives kind of person. And the other thing was that in the call center business, in the customer service business, there's a thing called first time resolution. What that means is if they talk to you and you do whatever it is you do for them, they don't call back on the same issue. That there's the first time they talk to a customer service person, it's solved, it's addressed. You figure out what the deal is and the customer solves their problem. Now, this seems kind of obvious that you should do that, but these companies keep records, and very often people call back about the same issue. I've done that with companies, certainly as a customer. So this woman was extraordinary. And one of the things we learned about her is a bunch of things, but one of them was, we said, how do you, what's your expectation here about, why do these people like you so much? Why do your customers give you such high ratings? And she said, well, I won't hang up on the person until I can hear them smiling. Now, initially, when I heard that, I thought, well, that's kind of funky. But then I realized you can hear often in a person's tone of voice if they're still upset or if they're happy with the solution. And they might use words to thank you profusely, but they might just have a different tone of voice. So I thought that was kind of interesting. In other words, she wanted to be sure at the end of the call that person was happy, satisfied, you'd solved their problem as far as I could tell, and they, would probably rate you 5 on a scale of 5. Another one, which was a big computer chip manufacturer, and we went to one of their factories, and they had this problem, which was what they called mean time between failure. And the idea was that these giant machines that produce computer chips had to be every month routinely, they were scheduled for maintenance. And so the maintenance techs would go in and they'd sort of take them apart in various ways. They'd lubricate stuff. They would replace the fluids. They'd, repair any parts that were worn down, that kind of thing. But some of them would start leaking fluid in particular, but other things in between these monthly check-ins. And it was like, well, why is that? And there were a couple of techs who that never happened with. Nothing ever broke down in between. So an example of this was that I and a few of the team there went and watched this guy who was taking down, putting back the machine. And it took some time to watch him. But at one point, as an example, when he was reassembling the thing, he got down on his knees and he reached underneath to a place that obviously he couldn't see. And he kind of lingered there. It's like, what's that, man? So somebody asked him, they said, what are you doing there? How come you're keeping, what's taking the top? He said, oh, let me show you. Here, stick your hand into there. And what he was doing was there was a little rubber seal, kind of like a plug, that went in a hole after it had been drained of its fluid. And he said, look, a lot of times these things kind of bubble around the edges. So I run my finger around the edge to be sure there's absolutely no kind of little wrinkle in this seal, because if there is, it's probably going to start leaking. Now, as soon as we saw that, it was one of those ones you say, oh, yeah, of course, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? But that wasn't in the documentation. It wasn't in the standard operating procedures. There was nothing in double check that your seals are properly, seated. So that was a nice example. Another one, and this is one of my favorites, telephone salesperson uh, who had really, really high close ratio. And in sales, what that means is the percentage of people that you speak with that you actually sell something to. Now, in this particular organization, organization was selling marketing information. This is pre-internet to small and medium-sized businesses, and mailing lists and other stuff, and helping people target their advertising and all of that. And so there was this one woman, and I remember it was in the Chicago office, who the average of most of the salespeople in their various offices was about 0.5. They would sell something pretty much to every other person, or one out of two people to talk to. But this woman was consistently up around 0.85 or 0.9, which meant she sold something to almost everybody she called. So she was a legend, actually, and I remember hearing about her for quite a while. So finally, this team of performance consultants that we were helping to develop were going to visit the Chicago office, and so they said, "We're going to go talk to this lady." So they went and they sat down with her. It was a Monday, and they said, "Can you show us how you do your thing with the client, the prospects?" So and the way they started in those days was they got these so-called lead sheets. It was a page for each prospect, and it had the name of the company, they had the revenue, the number of employees, the standard industrial code, which was the kind of business it was. Was it a accounting business, or a pizza store, a drugstore? What was it? It had other information. It had the key people to call. It had their phone numbers, contact information, all of that. So they handed her lead sheets for the week, and she sorts them into two piles and puts one pile over to the side. And then she starts to say, well, they said, wait a minute, what did you just do with those other ones? And she wasn't going to tell us about that or tell them about that. And she, well, look at the SIC codes. Those are pizza stores, and I forget what else, hardware stores, several kinds of companies, as indicated by the SIC code, standard industrial codes. And she said, I never sell anything to those kind of companies, so I don't even call them. Now, this was a little bit against the rules because she was given this list of prospects, but nobody was going to complain given her close ratio. So that was a little trick that she discovered. She kind of deduced from some experience, and that's what she did. Well, going forward, you can imagine they might have changed the way they sorted out the prospects that they gave people to call on, because she knew who was most likely to give her business, and she knew that a few of these types of businesses just weren't. They didn't do it. And then the last one was from a large biotech company that we've worked with on over the years, and they have research and development centers where they're standing up a new drug production process for some new biotechnology pharmaceutical. And a colleague of mine who's been doing this performance thinking work for a long time, she was working in one of these to help them set it up and to optimize their processes and like that. And one of the things she noticed was that the technicians who kind of were managing these things, this is a biotechnology product, and so it's actually a living organism produced from a living organism in these giant kind of rubber tanks that you'd go into the room, and it would be a clean room, but it would these big sort of bubbly kind of like inner tubes full of liquid, except they were giant. There'd be a whole bunch of them. And she noticed that the guys and the people that worked there would walk by them, and they'd put their arms up and literally kind of pat the bags. And it looked like almost a gesture of affection or something. It looked like, oh, man, I really like that biotech product. So at some point she asked them, and they said, oh, well, that's because we can tell by the sort of level of tension that the rubber or whatever the material was is kind of, how hard it is to press into it. We can tell if the living organisms, if the culture in there is working okay or not. So this was a kind of a quick and easeful way to get some feedback separate from the typical measures that they had of temperature and all the rest of it, just to be sure it was okay. And it was it was a technique they used that made a difference. They could determine pretty early on when some of these batches were not going well. So those are 4 examples. Now, if you think about the ones I've just described here, pretty much all of those are things that you would have to ask and observe about, because it wouldn't come out in your standard operating procedures. And those are the kinds of things we're looking for. So once we identify those bits, like, what do we do with it? What we want to do is look at how we influence behavior. And you guys all know this. This work that we do is really grounded in behavior science. And so we start out with Skinner's framework of discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses that hopefully lead to consequences, reinforcing stimuli. And somebody made that more plain English years ago: antecedents, behavior, and consequences. And then Tom Gilbert, of course, gave us his behavior engineering model, which built on Skinner's framework, but it recognized that we humans are individually different. And so there's this framework of functionally defined behavior influences in 6 categories rather than in 3. And you all kind of know about this, I think, or most of you do. And so I encountered this in about 1980 when I first was given a copy of his book. And I thought it was a cool model, and we started to use it because we were doing training stuff down in the knowledge box. But what we found was that when we started trying to engage our clients as partners, the language didn't cut it. They said, "What do you mean by data? Like, what is that? Or instruments? What is that? Is that an ohm meter? What is that?" Etc. So they found the language unclear, and they made a lot of category errors. So, as again, most of you know, I spent a few years tweaking that. And by about 1988, this is what we had. And it wasn't yet, we didn't know what to call it yet. A couple years later, one of our clients says, "You ought to call it the 6 boxes." But that's the framework we have for all of the behavior influences that can possibly support or get in the way of behavior. And if you want to go to a webinar that's in detail about the 6 boxes, that QR code will get you there. So, and by the way, I do like to make a deal of this, even though it's not that big of a deal. At the International Society for Performance Improvement Conference a few years ago, there was a colleague of mine, unbeknownst to me, who had a session where they nominated and voted for the best performance model in the world, and the 6 boxes won. And I think it's just because it's practical and straightforward. And here's all the stuff that probably ought to be in place, if possible, to support behavior. And here's all the stuff that obstruct or get in the way of behavior. So this is the framework we use. And so what we do is we identify that exemplary behavior, and then we try to change conditions to support it in everybody else. So let's go back to those examples. The customer service rep who waited to hear the customer smiling, we captured that and shared it with the supervisors or managers and said, "Tell your people, try to work with your customer until you can really hear them smiling, until you can tell they're happy from their tone of voice." So that was simple. That was just a box 1 expectation thing that supervisors could sort of establish and remind people of. The chip manufacturer, we just added this to the standard operating procedure, which is a tool, a box 2 thing, so that, be sure when you're putting back those plugs, you be sure that the seal is tight around the edges and there's no bubbles. The telephone salesperson, with these SIC codes that she didn't call because she knew she wouldn't sell it, that affected how the upstream folks who were sending prospect lists sorted those. So that was a box 2 thing also. So here's the tool, the lead sheets, and so we're probably going to at least deprioritize, if not eliminate, the ones in those SIC codes. And then the biotech patting the bags, that was just something that could be shared with the next research and development lab staff if they use that same kind of a procedure. So these are pretty straightforward things, but if you don't know what they are and you don't realize they make a difference, then you don't even look at them. So the summary of this, just to sort of put it all in a simple perspective, is first of all, you identify your top performers. Are there any people whose either whole job, maybe if there's like salespeople, so the whole process is really aimed at one big output, which is closed deals, or if it's some outputs in their job that they're extraordinary at, and we can identify that. We say, yeah, those 2 people are way better than everybody else. We got to figure out what it is they do. So if you identify the people, then ideally, what you do is you interview and observe those people along with some average performers, and you discover. You can't always discover all of them, but you discover the tricks, you discover the small strategies and tactics. And what I always suggest, I've been asked over the years sometimes to come in and do a quote best practices study or exemplary performer study, in which case we are all about this. This what the whole thing is like what are the outputs, and what are the extraordinary performers in this thing, and let's try to capture that. But what I've also noticed is that in almost any projects we do, if it's existing performance that's been in place for a while, we can actually apply a little bit of this by being sure we do, if there are any extraordinary performers, be sure that we do, identify them and go through this process as we analyze performance. And then, once we identify some of those bits of behavior, we then use the 6 boxes to configure the conditions to be sure that behavior occurs in others. And so in doing so, we can raise the average performance. We're not going to create LeBron James or Taylor Swifts, but we might get people a little bit closer to them because they might learn how LeBron fakes it or passes behind his back, or they might learn some stuff that we can capture from him, or we might learn how Taylor plans for her concerts or figures out where she's going to go, or whatever it is, how she sets herself up to write new songs, whatever it is. But the point is, we can enable other people to capture some of those tricks and incorporate them into their repertoire. So we've got a few minutes left, and I wonder if, I'm looking at the chat box now, I wonder if anybody has any questions or comments to make, or if you've done any of this kind of work yourself. So let me pause for a moment and see if anybody's still with me. So Erwin, interesting comment. Two types. One, there are two types of exemplary performers. One who outperforms other performers, and two, one who does things differently to produce outstanding impacts and value. So I'm not sure if I understand the difference between that. I think you can ask to speak if you want to talk on this platform. I'm not sure I understand the difference between those two. Because outperforming seems to me to be outstanding impacts and value. So can you explain a little bit more about what you mean, Erwin? I think it's an important distinction, but I'm not sure if I understand what you're pointing to. Any additional comments about that? Because I think what we're suggesting is that it's certainly what I've observed, but I maybe have not looked the world through that, which is usually if there are people who outperform other people, it isn't magic, it's there's doing something differently. And so what we're trying to do is what they do differently. And those are the stars we're going after. So Peter, yes, I know this concept came out of human competence. Erwin, yeah, I don't think I am hearing you. So let's see, what's trying to figure out. It says you can ask to speak. I've only done this sort of once or twice here, so I don't exactly know how it works, but I think, and I can't see it from your angle, Erwin. So speak. Okay, so now I think I just said yes. I'm pretty sure. Did I, or did I turn you off? Huh. No, man. I thought I accepted your request. I'm sorry if I cut you off. Well, you can type too, if I can't figure out how to use the sound feature. Oh, there you go. I see you.
Right. I'm going to turn off my camera because, for obvious reasons. So,
No,
so I've worked in large, aerospace and public utility organizations.
Hmm.
There were really high performers. Those were those people you're describing. They weren't
Okay.
necessarily called top performers, but they were very high performers, and they were very well appreciated to get more points on their merit increases and that sort of thing.
Right.
The whole other class of people who were the people you also kind of described as they were the go-to people.
Hmm.
They were people who had a broad understanding of almost everything. And so they could connect the dots in ways that other people couldn't, and they could explain them to people in a
Hmm.
manner that they could go, wow, I know how to do that now.
Okay.
And those from an executive level and high level leader level, those were the stars.
Gotcha. Okay, that's interesting. Well, I think one way to rephrase what you just said, it seems like, is that those ones could help you do what you were trying to do, because the first group maybe were doing something differently, but they maybe couldn't tell you about it or why or what they
Right,
were
right.
dots they were connecting. So that's pretty interesting. So that is a so it makes it easier if you have those people, I guess, is the point. That so but did you ever have the experience? Because this is kind of, I haven't thought about it the way you just said. So you added some value to my way of thinking for sure. But sometimes when you see people, and they may not be the absolute spectacular best, of everyone, but they have, really superior compared to average. Um, have you ever encountered those people who outperformed and maybe weren't very good at telling you how or why, but you could figure it out by observing, or was there a way to
Well,
penetrate
but
that?
both of those things. I mean, there were some people that couldn't, introspect on the things that they
Right,
knew how to
right,
do.
right.
But there were a number of people in these organizations, both at Boeing and at Metropolitan Water, who were really they people knew those people. If you go to those
Yeah,
people, they can help you. I happen to
gotcha.
be one of those people, actually,
Yeah,
but all of us and we knew each other, and
right.
what we all tended to have in common is we had just broad understanding about things. We didn't
Hmm.
we didn't just think about our job. We thought about
Right.
how do we create value? How do we connect the dots among the
Yep.
different places in the organization?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, it's, I can relate to that as I think about people in organizations I've worked with. I think I don't remember if I mentioned, but I was working with a medical technology company a while ago, and among their sales and marketing people, they had actually kind of like a social network, and they'd identified people who were kind of like what you were described, maybe not about everything, but who could definitely explain how to deal with the surgeon who was doing this, or how to work with a small medical office that had this, whatever it was. And you knew those guys had the tricks. They may not have everything that they were excellent at, but they were identified and people knew who they were. And so if they had a client like that or a prospect, they would call them and say, "Can you tell me how you do this? Let's
Yeah,
problem solve it."
and often they were good at conceptualizing stuff, new things
Yep.
especially,
Yep.
but they were also good of taking people who would tell you they can't conceptualize things like that. That's for the big guys and all that kind of stuff. But
Right.
what they could do is they could basically draw it out of people that had that
Yeah.
knowledge in them, and then
Yeah.
they could go, oh, I never thought about it that way.
That makes sense. Well, this is really probably an opportunistic leap, but that topic that I want to do about performance thinking next month is a little bit about the benefits of a simple but complete framework for performance that's enabled a lot of people I know to see stuff in a context that they hadn't seen before. So I wonder, if you go back to your examples, if there was a way of, even, like, for example, I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon who I've done some surgery on me. He always draws pictures of stuff. And he's always saying, "Well, let me show you." And he shows me a picture. Now I understand how the thymus connects up with the heart and why they can't do this and that. I wonder if it was possible to give people that didn't have that larger framework you're talking about, a way to see a bigger picture, maybe visually or otherwise. Is that? make any sense
Of
from your
course,
perspective?
yeah. I think visual stuff is, and data storytelling, for example,
Yeah.
you want to, you want to look at the spreadsheet, or do you
Yeah.
want to see a picture?
Right. Well, one of the couple points about this. So this is great. Thank you for this. But I've always thought that in training, if we were teaching somebody something, if we could set as an advanced organizer the larger process in which they were involved, we say, see, this is the big picture. This is where you fit in. We're going to show you how to do this. That a lot of lights would go on then, so people understood kind of downstream and upstream. So that's a little example of that, it seems like. Um, and it's quite interesting. The other thing is, what I've observed is that you can do, I think, what's her name? A woman who talked about cognitive task analysis, whose name, Ruth Clark. I think one of the things that I've done over the years is had people shown somebody something like a problem or a spreadsheet or a budget or whatever the heck it was, and said, can you tell me what you're thinking as you look at this? And sometimes that's the way to get it out too, because they maybe couldn't tell you the bigger context. But if you had them articulate, yeah, first I look at this and then I'm going over there and do that. So sometimes you can interview people in a way to unpack their inner thinking process. But thank you for this. This is a good distinction. I like it a lot. Um, Referring to Ian here, Ian says, in your experiences, you've seen organizations increase upside potential for average performers. You also see improvement in below average performers. I think, yeah, the whole thing about there's almost an old saw about, if you've got really bad performers, don't waste, they tend to suck up the time of their managers because they've got all kinds of issues. And the challenge is that a lot of times those issues are outside the context of work. They're going through a divorce, they've got an illness, they have a mother who's dying, whatever it is, or they have psychological challenges or something like that. And so sometimes we can't help them too much, but they can consume enormous amounts of management time. But just below average, in other words, if we're not talking about the people who are really having big trouble, I think the answer is yes. I think what we've seen is if I can share with people some of those tricks that I gave you examples of, everybody now will be checking to be sure that the little seal is properly seated, and so they're probably not going to have any more leaks, at least from that part of the machine, et cetera. So I think the general concept here, Ian, is that if we can capture those things and share the specifics, we can sort of move the whole curve up a little bit. And we're not going to create, whatever, Kobe Bryant's, but we'll get people better at basketball, maybe. Um, You'd also have a lot better criteria for future hiring once you got, yeah, that's true. It is. And also just onboarding. I mean, it hopefully enables you, like, I hesitate to say this, but what Erwin was talking about, having the big picture, I'm sure we've all been in these training and instructional design contexts like this. I was at a call center in a cell phone company 20 years ago, and early on in the onboarding or training for new customer reps, they had a whole hour devoted to the history of cell phones. And this is when they're saying, no, you really don't need to know that, dude. You really just need to know that there are different cell towers, and they hand calls off from, and sometimes you get drop calls. That's really all you need to be able to know to tell a customer why they get drop calls. But they were giving this whole big context. And so I think sometimes, in the way you described, Erwin, context is everything, and it helps people connect the dots. Other times people mistake kind of the history or the philosophy of X as being what's required for that. And I don't know if it always is. So you got to figure out if you were going to try to improve your onboarding, maybe it's just that you and your colleagues who were among those stars had been around for a long time and had seen it all. Sometimes that's how it works. But you can certainly maybe speed it up in terms of people. Like, for instance, another thing that I'm reminded of, often when we do interviews about performance, I will ask my client if there's any fast starters, if they have anybody who's just been on the job maybe a year or less, but who's really doing super well. And a lot of times you interview those people. And first of all, sometimes they do super well because they're just aggressive learners and they really lean into it. But you ask them questions like, what do you wish you'd known sooner? Or what stuff when you came in did you have to learn on your own? you ask those questions, and sometimes you can find ways to create an onboarding or new hire training experience, which is better because you realize what was missing. And some of that might have been, I didn't know the context of what I was doing here. Anyway, these are great comments. Any other, we're sort of over time now, but I appreciate both of you, Ian and Erwin, saying stuff. Both start with I is interesting. Maybe it's the eyes today that win. But any final comments? I don't want to keep us going here, but I appreciate the contributions here. I want to mention we have our performance thinking practitioner program where we teach this whole methodology, and the next open group starts January 6th. So if any of your colleagues are interested, please point them in this direction. You can go to our website also, and on the front page, there's a thing that says Open Performance Thinking Program. We also have, Barbara Buckland and I have revised our coaching program so that it is now not just something you do in class in the room. We actually have a virtual version of it. And we're looking for organizations that want to pilot that. And so we're open to having, making a good deal for that, because we really want to introduce it some places and sort of road test the virtual version a bit. So if you're interested, that QR code will get you to my calendar and you can make some time to talk with me about it. And then our application kits, which are going to be inexpensive digital templates for specific kinds of applications, are coming. They're not done yet, but you can get on the mailing list. So thank you, everybody. And this was great. It's way more fun if people ask stuff or make comments like you guys did. So thanks for that. And I think we're done.